In the fading, bloody twilight of the Middle Ages, as the glorious age of chivalry was giving way to the grim and impersonal age of gunpowder, there lived a man who seemed to be the living, breathing embodiment of every knightly ideal. He was a warrior of legendary piety who founded his own chivalric order dedicated to the defense of women. He was a celebrated poet, a crusader, and a marshal of France. And he was, by all accounts, one of the most skilled, feared, and respected fighters in all of Christendom. He was a man so confident in his abilities that he once issued a public challenge to the knights of Europe to fight him and two of his friends in dozens of back-to-back duels, a contest he dominated so completely it became the stuff of legend. His name was Jean Le Mangre, but he was known to the world by his title, Boucicaut. This is the story of the man many of his contemporaries considered to be the last true knight, a perfect warrior living at the very moment the world was making knights like him obsolete. A world in violent transition. To understand a man like Boucicaut, we first have to understand the world that forged him. The late 14th and early 15th centuries were a time of immense crisis and violent change in Europe. The old certainties of the medieval world were crumbling. For the noble warrior class, the knights, it was an age of profound anxiety. Their very reason for existing was being called into question. The primary driver of this crisis was the 100 Years' War, the brutal, seemingly endless conflict between England and France. This was not a war of noble charges and chivalrous encounters. It was a grinding, bloody slog that was revolutionizing the nature of warfare. The old feudal model, where a king called upon his knights to serve for a short campaign, was being replaced by the need for professional standing armies and new devastating technologies. The most significant of these was the English longbow. At battles like Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, English armies, composed largely of humble peasant archers, had stood their ground and unleashed terrifying storms of armor-piercing arrows. They had mown down the flower of French chivalry, proving that a well-disciplined force of infantry could systematically slaughter the elite, heavily armored knight on his expensive war horse. The knight's centuries-long reign as the undisputed king of the battlefield was coming to a violent and humiliating end. This military crisis created a fascinating cultural reaction. As the practical battlefield usefulness of the knight began to wane, the ideal of chivalry became more intense, more elaborate, and more performative than ever before. The nobility, seeking to justify their privileged place in a world that no longer seemed to need them, doubled down on the rituals that set them apart. The tournament and the joust became the ultimate expression of this hyper-chivalry. These were not just sporting events, they were elaborate theatrical spectacles where knights could prove their worth, their prowess, through individual feats of arms, winning glory and honor, in a controlled environment that was a world away from the muddy, arrow-filled battlefields where they were becoming increasingly irrelevant. It was into this world of crisis and pageantry that Jean Le Mangre, the second man to hold the title of Boucicaut, was born in 1366. He was destined from birth to be a warrior. His father was also a Marshal of France, one of the highest military honors in the kingdom. Young Boucicaut was raised on a steady diet of chivalric tales and relentless martial training. He was made a page at the French court, where he learned the arts of riding and fighting. He was a prodigy. By the age of 16, he was already fighting in battles in Normandy. By 18, he was on his first crusade. He also subjected himself to a personal training regimen that was legendary even in his own time. His official biography, Le Livre des Faits du Bon Messire Jean Le Mangre, dit Boucicaut, the Book of the Deeds of the Good Sir Jean Le Mangre, called Boucicaut, written during his lifetime, reads like a superhero's origin story. It describes him as a man of almost superhuman physical prowess. To maintain his strength, he would practice vaulting onto his warhorse while wearing his full, heavy suit of plate armor. He could allegedly perform a somersault in full armor, except for his helmet. His most famous feat was his ability to climb up the underside of a suspended ladder, rung by rung, using only the strength of his hands and arms, again while fully armored. He was an Olympic-level athlete in a 70-pound steel exoskeleton. This was the man who, in the year 1390, decided to put his legendary skills to the ultimate test, at the Grand Tournament. In 1389, a temporary truce was declared in the 100 Years' War. For the thousands of knights and men-at-arms on both sides of the conflict, this peace was a problem. Their entire lives were structured around warfare and the pursuit of honor. A truce meant a period of enforced idleness. Boucicaut, now a renowned warrior in his early 20s, and two of his close friends and fellow knights, Regnault de Roy and the Lord of Saint-Pie, decided to solve this problem by organizing the greatest tournament of their age. They issued a formal chivalric challenge, a proclamation that was sent to the royal courts and noble houses across Europe, but especially to England. They declared that they would hold a pas d'armes, or passage of arms, at a site near Calais, which was then an English-held territory in France. The location, Saint-Anglever, was chosen specifically to make it easy for English knights to attend. For 30 full days, from the 20th of March to the 20th of April 1390, the three French champions would hold the field against any and all worthy challengers who wished to test their mettle. A pas d'armes was a highly formalized and ritualized form of combat, governed by a strict set of rules. Boucicaut and his companions laid out the terms in their proclamation. Each of the three French champions had two shields, one painted with a device for peace and the other for war, hanging outside his pavilion. An arriving challenger would ride up and strike the shield of the champion he wished to fight. If he struck the shield of peace, he would fight a course of 5 jousts with a blunted lance, known as a lance de plaisance. The goal was to score points by breaking your lance cleanly on your opponent's shield or helmet. If he was seeking a more dangerous challenge, he could strike the shield of war. This meant he would fight with a sharpened, deadly lance of war, the lance à outrance. The goal here was not just to score points, but to physically unhorse or disable your opponent. The challenge at Saint-Anglever became the must-see event of the year. It was the medieval equivalent of the Olympics, and the Super Bowl rolled into one. Knights and squires from England, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain and beyond, flocked to the site to make a name for themselves by competing against the most celebrated champions in France. The fields around the jousting lists were turned into a massive festival filled with the colorful pavilions of the knights, the tents of merchants and crowds of spectators. For 30 days, the jousts ran from dawn until dusk. And according to the contemporary chronicles, particularly Boucicaut's own biography, his performance was nothing short of legendary. He was the star of the show. He was described as being a force of nature on the tourney field. While his two companions were both highly skilled, Boucicaut was in a class of his own. He consistently broke the most lances. He was never unhorsed. He fought with such skill and controlled violence that many of the English knights who challenged him were seriously wounded or knocked unconscious. The chronicles state that on one day he jousted against the famous English knight, Sir John Holland, the Earl of Huntingdon, and on another he engaged in back-to-back contests, fighting with a ferocity that left the spectators in awe. While the exact number of duels he fought is not recorded with perfect accuracy, the scale of the event was immense. With 3 champions fighting multiple challengers over the course of 30 days, the total number of individual jousts ran into the hundreds. The claim of 100 duels in the video's title is a slight and very understandable dramatization of an event where Boucicaut and his friends offered a challenge to fight dozens and dozens of individual contests. The chronicles are, of course, biased in his favor. They were written to portray him as the perfect knight. But even accounting for some heroic exaggeration, his performance at Saint-Anglever was so dominant that it cemented his reputation across Europe as the living embodiment of the chivalric ideal, the greatest tournament fighter of his generation. He had proven his prowess in the most public way imaginable, but the world was changing, and the skills of the tourney field would soon be put to a much more brutal test. A knight in a changing world, Boucicaut was far more than just a peacocking tournament champion. His entire life was a relentless quest for glory and a fulfillment of his duties as a Christian knight, which meant he constantly sought out real battlefields. Even before the Grand Tournament, he had been an active soldier. In his late teens, he embarked on what was known as a Prussian crusade. This was a common activity for ambitious and pious young knights from France and England. They would travel to the Baltic frontier to fight alongside the Teutonic Knights, a German military order. in their long and brutal war against the still pagan Grand Duchy of Lithuania. For a young knight like Boucicaut, it was a perfect opportunity to gain military experience, prove his religious devotion, and win honor, all while fighting in a conflict that was a safe distance from the politically complicated 100 Years' War. His reputation, however, would be truly forged and tested in the great conflict of his age, the war between Christian Europe and the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire. In 1396, the King of Hungary sent a desperate plea for aid to the courts of Europe. The Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, nicknamed Yildirim or the Thunderbolt for the speed of his military campaigns, was pushing relentlessly into the Balkans and threatening Hungary itself. A grand international crusade was called to stop him. A massive and fabulously wealthy army of knights, primarily from France and Burgundy, answered the call. Boucicaut, as a Marshal of France, was one of its senior commanders. This was the chance for the French nobility to prove that the chivalric way of war was still supreme. They were disastrously wrong. The Crusade of Nicopolis was a catastrophe of arrogance and poor planning. The French knights were contemptuous of their Hungarian allies and their more cautious strategies. They insisted on leading the charge, believing their valor and heavy armor would be enough to sweep the Ottoman army from the field. On September 25, 1396, near the fortress of Nicopolis in modern-day Bulgaria, the French knights launched a reckless, unsupported uphill cavalry charge. They initially smashed through the Ottoman frontline troops, but their charge lost momentum as they crested the hill, only to find themselves face to face with the elite of the Ottoman army. The Janissaries, a disciplined corps of infantry supported by elite cavalry. The exhausted French horses and knights were met with a hail of arrows and a forest of stakes. The charge collapsed. It was a slaughter. Thousands of the finest knights in Europe were killed or pulled from their horses and captured. Boucicaut fought with his customary legendary bravery, but he too was overwhelmed and captured. He was brought before Sultan Bayezid, who was enraged by the heavy losses his own elite troops had suffered. Bayezid ordered the execution of almost all the thousands of prisoners. The knights were stripped and led out in front of the Sultan to be beheaded one by one. But Boucicaut, thanks to his high rank and famous reputation, was recognized and spared from the massacre to be held for ransom instead. The Battle of Nicopolis was a brutal and humiliating lesson for European chivalry. It proved once again that the unsupported charge of heavily armored knights, the defining tactic of the medieval era, was no match for a modern, disciplined, combined arms army. Boucicaut eventually was ransomed for a colossal sum and returned to France. His ordeal had only enhanced his heroic reputation. He was seen as a great crusading hero, and he soon embarked on another expedition, this time leading a small force of French knights to the city of Constantinople to help the beleaguered Byzantine emperor defend his city against the same Ottoman threat. He fought with distinction there for several years, a Christian knight defending the last bastion of the old Eastern Roman Empire. His career was a whirlwind of activity. He was later made the French governor of Genoa, where he had to navigate the treacherous world of Italian city-state politics, proving he was more than just a soldier. But his destiny, and the destiny of his entire class, would be decided back in France, on another muddy field. The final charge. The final act of Boucicaut's life played out against the backdrop of a France that had descended into chaos. The French king, Charles VI, was suffering from severe bouts of mental illness. He would have periods where he did not recognize his own family and would run howling through the corridors of his palace. This power vacuum at the top led to a vicious civil war for control of the kingdom, pitting the faction of the king's brother, the Armagnacs, against the faction of his powerful cousin, the Duke of Burgundy, the Burgundians. Boucicaut, fiercely loyal to the crown, was a leading and uncompromising member of the Armagnac faction. It was into this divided and self-destructive France that the young and ambitious King of England, Henry V, decided to invade in 1415. Henry revived the English claim to the French throne and landed his small professional army in Normandy. After a long and difficult siege of the city of Harfleur, his army was ravaged by disease, and he was forced to march towards the English-held safety of Calais. A massive French army, many times the size of Henry's, was raised to intercept and destroy him. Boucicaut, now in his late 40s and still a Marshal of France, was one of the senior commanders of this great host. On October 25, 1415, the two armies met near the small village of Agincourt. The French were supremely confident. They outnumbered the English by at least 4-1. But what followed was one of the most famous and catastrophic military disasters in history. The French command, a committee of arrogant and squabbling high nobles, made a series of fatal errors. They chose to fight in a narrow, freshly ploughed field, hemmed in by two dense woods. This terrain completely negated their massive numerical advantage and gave them no room to maneuver their powerful cavalry. To make matters worse, it had rained heavily for days, turning the field into a deep, clinging quagmire of mud. Against all reason, the French decided to launch a direct frontal assault on the English position. Boucicaut and the other great lords, weighed down by their incredibly heavy, state-of-the-art plate armor, dismounted to fight on foot, leading the first wave of the attack. They had to advance over 1,000 yards uphill through a field of thick-sucking mud that came up to their knees. As they struggled forward, they were met with a relentless storm of arrows from the thousands of English longbowmen who were positioned on the flanks. The arrows, with their armor-piercing bodkin points, punched through the weaker points of the French armor, wounding and killing men and terrifying the few horses that were on the field. The French vanguard, exhausted and disorganized, finally reached the English line. A brutal close-quarters melee ensued. But the French were so tightly packed into the narrow space and so exhausted from their slog through the mud that they could barely lift their arms to fight. The lighter, more agile English soldiers butchered them. Boucicaut, the great hero, the peerless duelist, was trapped in the horrific crush of men and mud. He was overwhelmed and, like thousands of other French knights, was pulled down and captured by the English. The Battle of Agincourt was a cataclysm for France. An entire generation of its nobility was wiped out in a single morning. For Boucicaut, it was the end. Unlike after Nicopolis, there would be no ransom this time. Henry V had captured so many high-ranking French nobles that he couldn't possibly manage them all. In a controversial move, he ordered many of them to be executed on the battlefield. Boucicaut was one of the very senior commanders who was spared, to be taken back to England as a prize prisoner of war. He spent the final 6 years of his life in captivity, first in the Tower of London and then in Yorkshire. The great warrior and man of action occupied his time by writing poetry, melancholic verses about his lost glory and his longing for France. He died a prisoner in England in 1421. It was a quiet, sad and anticlimactic end for a man who had lived such a spectacular life. Boucicaut's life is a perfect and tragic symbol of the end of an era. He was a man who desperately strove to live up to an impossibly perfect chivalric ideal, a code of honor forged in a bygone age, while the world around him was rapidly making that ideal obsolete. He was the greatest tournament knight of his generation, a man who may never have lost a one-on-one duel. But the two most important battles of his life, Nicopolis and Agincourt, were catastrophic defeats where the very ideal he represented, the glorious chivalric charge, was systematically slaughtered by modern tactics and disciplined infantry. He was a man out of time, a throwback to a golden age of knighthood that perhaps had never truly existed outside of poetry and song. The story of Marshal Boucicaut, the knight who was a legend in the lists, is the story of how the very concept of the medieval knight was ultimately defeated, not by another champion but by the relentless and unforgiving march of history itself.